Hi, and welcome back to the panel room at ConTinual. Tonight, I have an esteemed panel of people and Keith to come in and talk about the world of Sherlock Holmes. I am your host this evening, Jim Nettles, and before we get started, I'm going to go around the room and to let everybody introduce themselves. So, Keith, I'll let you go first.
Oh, I see. That's my consolation for being insulted. Got it. Anyway. Hi, I am the apparently not very esteemed Keith R.A. DeCandido, a legend in my own mind. I have written a ridiculous amount of fiction, or an amount of ridiculous fiction, depending on which Amazon reviews you read. I've written in over 30 different licensed universes, from Alien to Zorro, and I've also written in a bunch of different shared worlds, including one created by one of my fellow panelists here, as well as Sherlock Holmes. And I've also written my own original fiction, including urban fantasies set in the somewhat real locales of New York and Key West, as well as fantastical police procedurals in the fictional settings of Super City and Cliff's End. I've also been an editor, a martial artist, a podcaster, a critic, and recently, for reasons passing understanding, the creator of a very small press with my wife, Ren Sims, which will be launching with an anthology called The Four Somethings of the Apocalypse sometime in 2022. So,
Jonathan?
I was just going to say both Jody and Jonathan are in that book too.
Oh. Hi, I'm Jonathan Maberry. I'm a New York Times bestselling author in multiple genres. I write horror, science fiction, fantasy, thrillers, mysteries, and so on. I write comics for Marvel, IDW, and Dark Horse. I also edit anthologies. I think my 22nd anthology is coming out. I almost said 22nd. It's been a long day. Anthology is coming out this winter called Aliens versus Predator: Ultimate Prey. And I had a TV show called V-Wars, which is based on a series of shared world anthologies that Keith's referring to, and also some comics for that. And I am now just about to break into a new genre, which is epic fantasy, and because of Sherlock Holmes. So I'll explain that in a bit, but I'm actually doing an epic fantasy series because of Sherlock Holmes.
And Jody Lynn.
I'm Jody Lynn Nye. I write science fiction and fantasy, most of it with a humorous bent. I've also collaborated with a number of noted writers, including Anne McCaffrey and Piers Anthony, Robert Asprin, and my latest collaborations with an actual rocket scientist, Dr. Travis Taylor, on some young adult fiction. I've dipped my toe now into writing for comics, and I'm looking forward to getting a chance to do some more. I also teach writing. I do the 2-day workshop at Dragon Con every year. This is year 11 for me. And I'm one of the judges of the Writers of the Future contest, which is the largest speculative fiction contest in the world, and also one of the only ones that is genuinely free to enter. And I got into Sherlock Holmes in sort of a labyrinthine way, and I'll be happy to talk about that when we get around to it.
Well, why don't we go ahead and start there? We all come to Holmes pretty early. Obviously Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle were very influential for me growing up, reading everything at probably even way too young of an age even then, catching him in pretty much every incarnation. So, Jody Lynn, why don't you go ahead and start with what the labyrinth is that walked you down the path to Holmes and Watson?
Well, I grew up on the Basil Rathbone movies that were put out in, I guess it's the 40s, all of the black and whites. And I thought that they were terrific. I loved these characters. I did not know at the time that they were from books. I was pretty small, but I really respected the character of Sherlock Holmes. I naturally, because I was too small, I missed all the references to cocaine and things like that. But he seemed to know what he was doing, and people were very interested in what he did. He seemed to do some sort of mental magic, knowing things that nobody else did. And I thought, I like fantasy. This works for me. I didn't realize that there was an actual aspect to what he was doing. But when I got to college, The 7% Solution had just come out as a novel. And one of my roommates, her mother was reading The 7% Solution. And I asked if I could borrow it when she was done with it. And she said, "Have you read the other Holmes stories yet?" And I said, I hadn't. She said, when you've read them, I will be happy to lend you this book. Well, that started me off on a frenzy of reading, not just the original stories. And I was at the University of Southern California, where they had actual copies of The Strand bound into big volumes. And some of them had suffered the razor blade of thieves. So there were illustrations missing, but nevertheless, to get to see the way that they were presented originally was terrific. I started buying pastiches and things from rare book dealers, including a couple from Otto Penzler, of whom was into Sherlock Holmes fandom, as well as creating his own literature. But I came to the movies first. So I have a few rare pastiche books, like the Misadventures of Sherlock Holmes, with some still uncut pages, a book that escaped the cull of the 1940s when the paper shortages, and have continued to enjoy the videos and pastiches, and being in the two anthologies that were edited by my co-presenter here, Jonathan, and there's one. Yes, I've got my own copy here, and I had tremendous fun with that, and looking for other opportunities. I am also married to a man who has written in the Mycroft Holmes universe, along with Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, Bill Fawcett, and Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, under the name Quinn Fawcett. Mycroft Holmes Mysteries and Madame Vernet Investigates. Sherlock often talked once about my grandmother was a sister of the artist Vernet. Well, here's her story.
How about you, Jonathan? How'd you wind up being introduced into the dynamic duo?
Well, my first introduction was, I probably saw in fact, I remember seeing some of the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce stories on TV, but it didn't grab me at the time, partly because, and this is something that gets me, has people throw shoes at me, because I don't like those movies, because they made Dr. Watson an idiot, and he's not an idiot. And it bothered me that he was an idiot.
It was okay when I was 8.
Yeah. Well, I think the first one I saw was The Woman in Green. And then shortly after that, we had a Scholastic Book Fair in my elementary school. And we're talking 1966, I guess this was. And there was, for a quarter, I got a brand new copy of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And it was actually not the one that we know as the first Adventures. It was actually just a collection called that, with stories from throughout. And I fell in love with the stories. Watson was often my favorite character, though I loved Sherlock Holmes too, because he was such a put-upon guy, and he was Joe Normal, but he was also a doctor and a soldier, and he was kind of cool. So that was my introduction to it. Devoured Sherlock Holmes after that, 7% Solution, and there was another one after that I think he wrote. I forget what that one was called. But also like August Derleth's Solar Ponds, pastiches, which were very funny. And tons of other things along the way. My deep love of it came when Jeremy Brett played Sherlock Holmes on Grenada television. In fact, I just recently rewatched every episode of that, and it's a shame that Brett was very sick, and then eventually died toward the end. At the end of that run, but for a while he was the perfect Sherlock Holmes. He still is my gold standard as the perfect Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes. There have been other great interpretations, but it made me want to reread the books. I wound up getting, out of the blue, invited to an anthology. Michael Noss was doing an anthology called Legends of the Mountain State, Volume 2, which is basically folklore of West Virginia, right? And he assigned me a piece of folklore to write a story about. And I happened to have been reading a lot of commentary about Holmes, and the bit of folklore took place in 1896. And according to the commentary I was reading about Holmes, he was in America in 1896. I'm like, So I wound up writing my first Holmes story. On the strength of that, I was invited to a Sherlock Holmes anthology that Laurie King and Leslie Klinger was doing, Echoes of Sherlock Holmes. And then from there, I went up going to the Baker Street Regulars, dinners at the Yale Club with Neil Gaiman and that crowd. Otto Penzler was there; he's always there, and it was just a lot of fun. I am now a dyed-in-the-wool Sherlockian, and I mentioned that I credit Sherlock Holmes in a way getting me into writing fantasy. When we were doing Baker Street Irregulars, I wound up doing a story for the anthology. Michael, my co-editor, really pushed me for that one. And I did one that was actually a fantasy. This whole book was Sherlock Holmes without Sherlock Holmes. It's the model of Sherlock Holmes, but other characters. And I did one in a fantasy world where it was an older woman who was an investigator for the Office of Miracles, and her assistant, who, like her, was a skeptic on everything. She was, she did not believe in miracles, even though she worked for that church. And I loved writing the story, and I realized that model works, for everyone. So I went up taking those characters, and I'm starting a new series with Macmillan in May, Kagan the Damned, and they're supporting characters, and they continue on with a lot of their the qualities they brought, to that story, the Holmes and Watson qualities. I went up including in this fantasy series I'll be writing. So I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. I love so many iterations of it. I'm sure we'll talk about that, but that's how I got into it. And I just finished not only rewatching the Jeremy Brett, but listening to Stephen Fry's complete read of everything except the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, because that's not public domain. And I went and listened to somebody else read that. Love me some Holmes.
How about you, Keith?
I came late to being a Sherlock Holmes fan. I was obviously aware of Sherlock Holmes because it's not really possible to exist in the world and know anything about pop culture without knowing about Sherlock Holmes. But it was a case of encountering the character here and there. I distinctly remember enjoying the movie The 7% Solution as a kid, which I actually came to bizarrely because I remembered seeing Nicole Williamson play a particularly bizarre version of Merlin in Excalibur, and I found out he was in The 7% Solution. I thought, oh, this would be cool to watch. Plus, it was by Nicholas Meyer, who directed the second Star Trek film, and so I was curious in that. So I watched that. Young Sherlock Holmes came out when I was a teenager, and there was one. Oh, and wonderful movie with Michael Caine and Ben Kingsley called Without a Clue.
Yeah.
So it was all these, different interpretations of Holmes, but I never really got into the character very much until at one point I watched a couple of the Jeremy Brett TV adaptations, and they sucked me right in. And that led me to actually finally sit down and read the damn things. And so it wasn't until I was, in my 30s really that I started really paying attention to it. And since then, I've completely become a complete Holmesian fangoober, and really enjoying all the different screen interpretations, not just Brett's, but Robert Downey's and Benedict Cumberbatch's and Johnny Lee Miller's and Ian McKellen's, and going back and finding others over the years, including two particularly terrible ones by otherwise good actors. I'm thinking Matt Frewer and Tom Baker, who both are excellent actors and who were terrible Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And all the different stories, and I contributed to both Baker Street Irregulars anthologies as well. And I loved all the different takes that people had on them, which was tremendous fun. So yeah, it's something I'm a huge fan of police procedure generally, and I love writing mysteries, even if it's in other genres. I mean, I've written a lot of mysteries that are in science fiction, fantasy, and superhero settings. And part of what I love is the deductive process, the process of investigating a crime, of following the evidence, of questioning people and finding things out and figuring out how something happened and why something happened, and getting at the truth. Plus, I'm a big fan of what is often called competence porn, with characters who really know what they're doing, and nobody knows what they're doing more than Sherlock Holmes. So.
Well, and I think that kind of goes to a good place to start. I mean, so within your own universes, with the work you've done, crafting Holmesian type stories, whether it is really Sherlock Holmes or just in that space, what are kind of the characteristics? What really makes a Holmesian story and a Holmesian character for you? Is it the Holmes and Watson relationship? Is it the deductive reasoning? Is it his approach? Is it the vices? Is it his sometimes lack of connecting with people and culture? So, Jonathan, I'm going to go with you first on that one.
All right. Well, part of it is definitely the Holmes and Watson relationship, because they have a genuinely good friendship. But what a lot of people who haven't read the complete series fail to realize is that Watson left, got married a couple times. And then, toward the end of Holmes' career, they were seeing each other either every couple of months or every couple of years. But they were still friends. As soon as they were together, they'd fall back into that same routine again. And that's true of real friendships. You can have these long gaps, but you have a serial friendship that just picks up where it left off. And that to me was very genuine. And I wonder who Doyle modeled Watson after in terms of his relationship with Holmes. But also the deductive reasoning thing is fun. I mean, it's really hard to defend it because he's making a lot of intuitive leaps and also limiting the amount of possible other things it could be. So it's deduction, but also the frequency with which he is actually correct. That's more of the fiction stuff, but it's very entertaining to those scenes when he does that, especially as the series goes on. You can tell Doyle got tired of it, but it's the fans loved it. So Holmes would do a little bit of it just to entertain, or explain how, effective he was. And then they get past that, and then they go into a little more practical problem solving. But I love that hypervigilance, but also the deep body of knowledge. And this is what speaks to that competence porn. The deep body of knowledge you need to have in order to be able to make those inferences, draw inferences from these things. Because if you don't have the knowledge, you can't have the your imagination has no food to play with. And it's funny, because it speaks to something I had a discussion with my son years ago. He didn't feel that it was as important to know a lot of stuff because you could look everything up on the net. And my thought has always been, if you have a big body of knowledge, you know what to look for. And, from the very beginning, Holmes was feeding his brain with the sort of things that made it the fertile ground for data to then grow within his imagination of what possibilities could be. That absolutely fascinates me.
How about you, Keith?
There's a lot of different elements, and I think it's telling as to how many of them there are, that when people do different interpretations of Holmes, they tend to focus only on one or two of them. Like when in Sherlock, they focused mostly on his lack of social skills, and his desire to know things. In Elementary, they focused on his drug addiction and how much differently he approached his drug addiction as a 21st century person as opposed to a 19th century person. It's like everybody has their own thing they focus on, and all of that is what makes it up. But a lot of it, I think, is just the insatiable quest, like Jonathan said, to know stuff. He wants to know the truth about things. He wants to learn constantly. He's got experiments going on in his house. He's always reading stuff and writing monographs about things. One of the things I particularly love about the Cumberbatch version is that he is constantly poking around at things on his phone. But because of course he is. He is constantly looking for more stuff to fill his head with. But a big part of it is also the relationship with Watson. Part of it is just from a narrative point of view, it gives him somebody to talk to. Even in other, like one of my favorite Holmes pastiches is Laurie King's Mary Russell books, and Mary Russell takes on the role that Watson takes on in the books. It's still giving Holmes somebody to talk to and to bounce ideas off of, you need that from a literary perspective, but it also makes the character a bit better. I mean, the thing, like Jonathan, I really didn't like the Basil Rathbone movies because they made Watson out to be an idiot. And Watson isn't an idiot. He's the only one who can keep up with Holmes. He looks like an idiot compared to Holmes because everybody looks like an idiot compared to Holmes. But he's the one who can, keep up with him and follow along with him, and also occasionally kick him back in bounds when he gets a little too crazy. It's one of the things I particularly liked about Jude Law's version of Watson in the Robert Downey films. He was very much, the guy who sort of kept him focused.
And also Watson was a published writer. So, there's a little bit of that love right there.
Yeah.
He'd been through medical school.
Yeah.
Well, the 19th century version of medical school.
Well, it's still better than any layperson is going to do.
And how about you, Jody Lynn? I mean, what else do you really want to grab onto that defines Holmesian story and Holmesian characters?
Naturally, it's somebody with a problem who comes to that safe haven where they hope that somebody will be able to solve something that seems absolutely insoluble. And I love the approach for that. Yeah, the knowledge porn is definitely part of it. Holmes tends to go for whereas the Jack of all trades has the broad but shallow knowledge, he has narrow but deep. But there are a lot of those oil wells in his field, and he delves insanely into something the way that a lot of intellectuals do. And one of the wonderful things about their friendship is that Watson is always pulling him back to reality and saying, you really should look into this case because this person needs help. He's the humanizing influence. He is our avatar, our representative in the story. And he's also there to say, Holmes, what are you talking about? Please speak, please speak down to us people who are not following all of the insane speed of the synapses in your brain. Let's hear how you got from point A to point B in some sort of sense. And that allows Holmes, the thing that he needs very much is just to show off for someone. And Watson is the perfect audience because he loves Holmes. He cares deeply about his friend. And he's always shocked when something terrible happens to him. He wants him to be well. He doesn't want him to use drugs. But it's a complementary relationship the two of them have. Is Holmes gives Watson someone to care about and to write about and to be interested in. Holmes also provides him with an extra stream of income when he doesn't, naturally, obviously, things are not working out well for a jobbing doctor because he doesn't seem to work with the hospital very often or have his own surgery too often either. And no, he can't be an idiot because he does, in fact, follow Holmes pretty closely. And he does call him on his nonsense when it's necessary. And because Holmes has become one of the archetypes, like King Arthur or Robin Hood, that people think that they could write him very well. And many people have tried, and I've read some truly terrible pastiches. I've read some truly wonderful pastiches and some truly wonderful parodies like Robert Elfish's Sherlock Holmes and so on, because those people have figured out what it is that makes a good Sherlock story tick. You have a wonderful puzzle to be solved. There's real peril involved. It's something that can be explained in this fabulous unfolding of fact after fact after fact and Doyle played fair. He would provide you with the clues, and if you knew enough about 19th century England, you could usually figure out some of the things that he was talking about based upon what he described. And he was very good at describing his scenes. So I appreciated the way he was telling that. And I too am a huge fan of the Jeremy Brett series because I see in that series the way that the friendship unfolds and how the two of them rely on each other so beautifully. And there is danger, and they go into it knowing, with their eyes open that things could get very bad, but they still do it. And one of the things that I think people love about mysteries is that a problem is posed, a problem is solved. And if it isn't solved, we still get something satisfactory at the end of it. That's, I think, one of the enduring appeals of detective fiction is that it's not open-ended. There's a problem, there's a solution, or there's a conclusion in any case.
Resolution. You know,
There's one other thing about Holmes that I meant to mention that I think is important also, is his sense of justice.
Yes.
One of the mistakes, Jody was mentioning that, mistakes that some people make when they write Holmes, and I think one of the biggest mistakes they make is to write him as unemotional, because he isn't. He's not emotional very often. There are a few things, however, that will get an emotional response from him, and one of them is injustice being done. It pisses him off if somebody gets away with something they shouldn't have, particularly if it's something a particularly heinous crime. And a lot of why he does what he does, yes, it's part of it is the intellectual stimulation, but part of it is also because he wants bad guys to be punished for doing bad things.
And because he's not actually a police officer, he is not bound by their rules.
Right.
Yeah. That's the other part of the, and this is what I was going to say too about his sense of justice, is there are times he realizes that the law is not just. If somebody commits a crime, they have to be punished for it. But what if they committed the crime for a very good reason? And there was one where there was a sailor who was in love with a woman. I forget, was it the Crooked Man? I forget the name of this particular story, where the husband was actually brutalizing the wife, and the sailor had fallen in love with her and comes to the house and winds up getting into a fight with the guy and kills him. He would go to jail for it, but
Holmes he would hang for it.
Yeah, another one, and this is my favorite of all the Sherlock Holmes stories, is the Blue Carbuncle, which not only was a great story, but was the best Jeremy Brett episode, because he realized that the guy who committed the crime is such a small, petty person who was more on impulse and is clearly torn apart by what he's done. And he doesn't want to send him to jail. He just says, the guy says, look, I'll fly. The charges will break down against the other guy. And he lets him go. And it's one of the rare cases where Watson is actually angry with Holmes because he's breaking the law. But, Holmes is saying, I'm not here to supply the deficiency of the police department. And
I think that is that the one with the little quote that I think we must have a little amnesty in that direction.
Yes. Yeah, I believe that is that one. And there's 3 or 4 where the criminal is let go, where they choose not to, like there's some that are political, dealing with
right.
Like South American, Central American politics and so on that come along. And his sense of justice is he wants the case to end with the right person getting caught, but more important to him is the solution. If he gets the solution, he can then determine whether it goes to Scotland Yard, because he doesn't necessarily need the fame, or if the person can escape. But he needs to be in command of that moment, and that is all comes down to his sense of justice and fair play, which is criminally underappreciated in the fan base.
But so vital.
Yeah,
and
it wouldn't be Holmes without that, though.
Yeah, and what about some of the other people that Holmes is surrounded by? I mean, I always love to see Mycroft, because Mycroft is an interesting foil, and with the different representations we've seen of Mycroft and how Mycroft has come into play. Sometimes he's represented as the buffoon. Other times he's represented as the smarter foil. What has really sharpened Holmes. And I think that's one of the things that I like to see, is that challenge to Holmes. So what about some of the, whether it's Mycroft, whether it is Lestrade, whether it is even some of the irregulars, how do you perceive the rest of that world that builds it around for Holmes, and how these are the people that he really interacts with and has that relationship with? What about you, Keith?
He's got an interesting supporting cast, and they all do have differing functions. What particularly interests me is the different people tend to default to Lestrade, but he is one of about a dozen different detectives.
Frankston, Bradstreet, et cetera,
right?
et cetera.
Yeah, there were a bunch of them, but What's interesting is, looking at it from a modern perspective, there's a lot of the stuff that Holmes did then is stuff that a normal police detective would be able to do now. Policing was much different in the 19th century. And there was a lot of times crimes would only be, especially in large metropolises like London and like New York and Paris and so on, crimes would only be solved if the person could pay a sufficiently large bribe to the cops. The Holmes was necessary, at least in part, because the police weren't necessarily there to help out the average person, and that made for a much different dynamic than you would get in a more modern story. And the other thing is that the other one I like who is underappreciated also is Mrs. Hudson, who has the unenviable task of being his landlady, which can't be easy. Like Watson, a lot of her function is to basically, not just keep him in bounds, but make sure he feeds himself periodically.
How about you, Jody Lynn?
I like Mrs. Hudson. I feel for her because he is destroying her premises, but obviously he's paying enough rent that she can get by with it. And she puts up with a great deal, but I think that she has a great deal of affection for him. I keep thinking of the, I can't remember the name of the one. I think it was just called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It was a movie with Colin Blakely as Watson. A long time ago. And they hear noise coming from downstairs, and Watson says, "Perhaps Mrs. Hudson is entertaining." And Holmes says, "I have never found her so." It's a very good movie. It's detailed. Everyone explores the things about him. What she must have had to put up with, with street urchins who probably had bugs and certainly dirty feet coming in and out of her nice, clean premises. And I often wonder what is going on with there's probably a tenant in 221A, and we never hear about that person. Or has Holmes simply driven that one away and is using it as a storeroom? I don't know. Speaking as an older sister, I thought about Mycroft a good deal because he's supposed to be about 7 years older than Sherlock, which meant that he was quite developed by the time his little brother came along and started to show his genius. But Mycroft is also a genius. He was there before Sherlock was intelligent and absorbing things, and there might be a little bit of jealousy, but I think at the same time, he is the protector. He has his own responsibilities. I love the fact that he is in fact the English government in a way. But at the same time, he determined a long time ago that being sympathetic or coddling Sherlock was not going to work. So he's like the bracing shower of cold water to get his brother to get up and move, because Sherlock does tend to be lazy, except when he's profoundly interested in something. And as an older sibling, sometimes you do have to say, get up and do this, because our parents are not here, so it's up to me. And I like that about him. Yes, I have great sympathy for the police who had to deal with Sherlock, but I think if they were honest, they would welcome somebody who would give them full credit for solving a crime, and also free them up from the possibility of having to deal with the consequences of possibly arresting someone who was too noble to spend any time in jail and could make things very, very ugly for them. So there's a lot of real London in there, and it gives such a great picture to the reader of what felt like it was going on at the time. Doyle was a great observer.
Some of my favorite supporting characters, well, Mycroft was never my favorite. I liked Charles Gray's version of him in the first couple of times he was in Greek Interpreter, and another one in the Jeremy Brett. But later on, when Jeremy was too sick, they had Mycroft do more, and Charles Gray was not given the right script for it. They made him almost a bungler.
And so wrong.
You needed someone who's cold and precise rather than just a bumbler. But some of the other supporting characters, like he has great characters who are only there for like one story. Like is it the Master Blackmailer or the Illustrious Client? I think it was Illustrious Client. Had a character named Shinwell Johnson, who was kind of basically a bad guy who turned into a good guy, and he was the muscle that Holmes used, but he was only in that one story, and he was a great character in the story and in the episode. He was great. The guy who played Mycroft in Enola Holmes, the recent, so I don't know if you guys saw this one about Sherlock Holmes and Mycroft had a younger sister, and played by Millie Bobby Brown. Is it Millie Bobby Brown? Millie Bobby, whatever.
Yeah.
From Stranger Things.
From Stranger Things. Yeah.
She did a great job, and Henry Cavill did an interesting job as Holmes, not who I see as Holmes. But the other guy who played Mycroft would actually have been a better Holmes. He's more the ascetic type. But again, they just don't give him enough to do. They want Sherlock to look impressive, but if his brother is smarter than him, they should show that more clearly. And there hasn't been as much. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's Mycroft books do a little better job with it. And actually, Fawcett Quinn did a pretty good job with Mycroft, giving it a little more to do, a little more depth and spin.
Quinn Fawcett, she got top billing.
Quinn Fawcett, sorry. But I also like some of the regional police officers. There were a couple who were clearly studying Holmes's method, like the detective in Thorbridge, the one from Wisteria Lodge, played by wonderful Freddie Jones. They're studying his methods. Some don't. Of course, they don't get it completely right, because where would Sherlock Holmes have his place in the story? But you can see that his influence is raising the level of police, which, in fact, the Sherlock Holmes stories did.
Yes.
They raised the level of forensic evidence collection and analysis, far beyond where it would have gone had those stories not existed.
Yeah.
And
I add Pudd'nhead Wilson to that made people more aware of fingerprinting.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And when I was doing a book where I was researching a lot of forensics and spent some time at the Philadelphia Forensics Lab, which is designed actually by the French police, because they actually have the best forensics labs in the world. Britain number 2, we're number 3. But everywhere you look in the forensics labs, there are Sherlock Holmes stuff. Posters, books, bobbleheads, you name it, because they all look to him as, a lot of them, as the reason they got into forensic science in the first place. So those types of supporting characters made it enforce the realism of the story for me, because you can see the echoes of that all the way down to today's forensic science. Shows like CSI would not have existed had there not been a Sherlock Holmes series.
So why don't we kind of go down that path? What are some of the other series we see, books, TV, movies, that are obviously, Sherlock Holmes influenced? What are they doing well? What are they not doing? And are they really paying a good homage to the influences that is Holmes, to give and bring kind of that level of creativity and that level of innovation to a modern audience? So who wants that one first?
Oh, I'll go first on that one. So I have a bunch that I love. The three I think of the best television ones are Monk with Tony Shalhoub. They even went so far as to give him a Mycroft type older brother, who was played by John Turturro. The TV show House, which was a medical version of it. I mean, his name was the name House, and his Holmes House, and his sidekick was named Wilson. But that was very much intended to be a medical version of Sherlock Holmes. And my personal favorite, which is Law and Order: Criminal Intent, mainly because I absolutely adore Vincent D'Onofrio's Robert Gorin, and I absolutely adore Catherine Irby's Alexandra Eames, who was the perfect Watson character, because she is a great detective on her own, and she's the only one who can keep up with Gorin, which was put into sharp relief when they partnered. Irby was pregnant, so they had to write her out of the show for a few episodes. And the person that they partnered him with, really couldn't keep up with him at all. But that was a really good, Criminal Intent in particular was a very good modern interpretation of Holmes. And it's telling that when they tried to do something else with it, particularly with Jeff Goldblum's character, it just didn't work. With Chris Noth, it sort of worked because he was playing a character that already existed. So they weren't trying to do Holmes with it. It was just a more straight up thing. But Goldblum's character just didn't work at all. But D'Onofrio and Irby were just a perfect Holmes and Watson, I thought.
Yeah, I one of my favorite takes on Sherlock Holmes is a comedy show, Psych.
Yes,
it was a silly comedy show, but it's Sherlock Holmes. He is hypervigilant, and he's filled with data. We find that his father trained him to be observant, but he had a gift that went beyond the training, so he's even more observant, more of a Sherlock Holmes than his dad was. His dad's a little closer to one of the brighter cops in the London police force in that model, And Gus, his best friend, is the Watson character, who again is a competent person. He's a pharmaceutical sales rep, competent guy, but he's the Watson there. He doesn't have that set of gifts, and it's a fun show. It lasted for a long time. The guy who played Sean in that show, the main character, is a buddy of mine, James Rodriguez, and he's just an amazing guy, and he is a huge Sherlock fan. And he said when he got that gig, everybody on the set, all the writers, were all reading Sherlock Holmes stories because they were picking out things they could give to Sean to notice.
Right.
And it was
Really?
fantastic.
That's great.
Yeah. And that was one of my favorites. And they're still doing the movies. They're still doing Psych movies. They're working on the third one, But it was a great show. And, the relationship with the cops is very much the same relationship. There's the smart cop that he likes and the kind of big, dumb, but still effective cop that it's his foil, Timothy Omundson. And, it was such a fun show. But it's Sherlock Holmes. But the thing is, they never mention it, and none of the reviewers picked that up, which really disappointed me because it's so clearly a Sherlock Holmes show. That is my favorite. Of course, House. The Mentalist, I thought was a weak attempt to do a more socially amiable version of Monk. I thought Monk was the better show.
Yeah,
and it was also charming, and there is a charm to the Holmes and Watson story, and a charm to the model of Holmes and Watson. The two unlikely friends who bond over this one thing, bringing their individual skill sets, and clearly having fun with it. They wouldn't be doing that if they weren't having fun. So, but Psych is definitely my favorite non-Sherlock Holmes version of Sherlock Holmes. Jody?
I have to go back to Monk because for me that was a perfectly wonderful one. All of Holmes's quirks and needs to be able to think and operate are just blown up and exponentially in Tony Shalhoub's portrayal. And he is funny and sad and brilliant all at the same time. And in a way, you get the idea that without his mad quirks, without his counting things, the OCD, he would never have been as effective an investigator as he is with all of his weirdness and quirks and his inability not to count or to clean. But it makes him tremendously effective and memorable. Some of the series I am sure have gone by that were meant to be Holmes pastiches were unfortunate in that they didn't create a memorable character. The Psych is great for that also, because you remember Sean doing these very weird things. He does mentalist tricks, and by mentalist I mean stage magician. Mm-hmm. He sees things in people and he makes it seem like almost mind reading, because what he's doing is reading those tiny tells. He would make a great stage magician
and poker
because
player.
He sees those things. And Holmes too would make a great stage magician, but he just can't be bothered. But I think
that's true. That's true of Sean Spencer too. He would be a great stage musician, but that would be work.
Yeah, and that's work. He would rather not work, and neither would Sherlock. He would rather study things, but he kind of gets pushed into studying a case just because something interested him, something tweaked his mind, something that related to what he was currently studying came up, and that's. I think that Monk and Psych are probably the best of the bunch. I disapprove on principle of House because, like a lot of television, he should have been arrested a long time ago. He should have had his medical license stripped. So long ago, there shouldn't have been as many seasons as there were.
What's so good?
They are good, and I love the actor, and I really appreciated the series, and yes, there was the chime of Holmes and Watson and House and Wilson, but there's this little thing at the back of my mind saying, "Stop that! Why doesn't anybody take this away from him?"
One of the things I like, especially about Psych, is that that version of Holmes and Watson. If you read A Study in Scarlet, these guys are basically, I mean, Holmes is a grad student. These are guys in their 20s. And they're constantly casting middle-aged white guys as Holmes and Watson. Mm-hmm. And if you actually look at, especially the earliest stories, they're not older guys. These are two very young men. Yeah. And you almost never see that at all. The close, I mean, honestly, the
BBC version is
BBC version. Different. Yeah, the Cumberbatch and Freeman are close, but even they are older. It really should be somebody younger playing them, and you almost never get that. And I'd love to see somebody actually really play them that way, as a grad student and a guy just out of medical school.
And so what about the other side of this? I mean, because again, if you've got Holmes, you've got the brilliant mind, you've got somebody that has to untangle the puzzle, but it's got to be an interesting puzzle. It can't be boring. It can't be common. It can't be simple. So if you look at that, if you look at the next phase of that, you've got to look and have a good antagonist. You've got to have someone fun on the other side to play with. You've got to have the other side of the foil. And I think that's one of the things that we've talked about. Sometimes it was the simple criminal. Sometimes it was just something to be undone. So how do you see kind of the really good antagonist? We all go to Moriarty because everybody knows Moriarty, but
I don't go to Moriarty. Moriarty's terrible. Moriarty is one of the worst characters in the entire history of English literature. The Final Problem is one of the worst stories in the English language ever written by somebody who was otherwise competent. I hate Moriarty. Moriarty was a cheap plot device that was done because Conan Doyle was sick and tired of writing Sherlock Holmes and wanted to get rid of him. He's a really tiresome deus ex machina with no actual personality who was retconned into the story in order to give him a worthy antagonist to kill him. And it was so successful that he had to bring him back a couple years later because they wouldn't leave him alone. Anytime somebody uses Moriarty in a Holmes pastiche, I think they haven't actually read the story. Moriarty is the least interesting character in all of Sherlock Holmes stories, and I can't stand it. There's so many more interesting
characters. Did with him.
I'm sorry, that's a rant that's like been sort of queued up since we started the panel.
I like what Nicholas Meyer did with him. That he's just old mathematics professor.
Yes,
that Sherlock hated.
Yes, that the 7% solution is the only good version of Moriarty. I like what Elementary did with it also by combining
Irene Adler.
Irene Adler with Moriarty, which was an interesting twist.
Yeah, and they did some interesting stuff in the BBC Sherlock with him. But again, I didn't. There are other characters that are better.
Yeah,
and you kind of if you see a Sherlock Holmes coming up, you're almost bracing for another Moriarty. Among my favorite villains, the Master Blackmailer was an amazingly dangerous. Yes, he was an amazingly dangerous villain, and I'm blanking on his name, but the illustrious client, the villain in the illustrious client, who was the one who would collect women, use them, and just discard them. He was such a vile character that he's Jeffrey Epstein of the 19th century, and he was amazing. He was great. There are a number of really good villains in the Holmes work, but unfortunately, they're one shots. They're one and done. I would like to have seen some of those maybe escape punishment and come back for another story. But they kept using Moriarty, and even when he did Valley of Fear, they kept using Moriarty. But Moriarty's not in the story. He's just referred to a lot in the story. It's the Moriarty effect. The people who are doing the bad stuff in his name or because of him are far more interesting than he is.
Yeah. So Moriarty's really only a two-shot, really. I mean, he's not even...
And you're right, he was retconned into the series.
Yeah.
As if he's always been there and suddenly Watson's just now finding out about it. Yeah.
Holmes likes to brag. Part of the problem with that is when Doyle started to lose interest in writing Sherlock, it was easy to go back to Moriarty or part of the Moriarty gang, because once you have constructed the empire of crime that he was supposedly the Napoleon of, that there would continually be bits that Sherlock would be coming across that hadn't been dismantled or hadn't been discovered yet. So it was a convenient trope that he could use. And it didn't make Moriarty any more of a better or more believable villain. But I think that he was looking for a way out.
Yeah. And nothing that Moriarty did in the stories really sold that he was this brilliant man. You know, he was
wrestling with somebody who is younger and more fit and knows of martial arts. That was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And falling over a cliff.
And then falling over a cliff.
If nothing else, Moriarty would have said, you know, put his gun down, put his stick down. They got close. He pulled a Derringer and shoot him. That's what a master criminal will do. Ha ha. But no, you know, it was silly.
Well, you know, falling off the cliff was the original jumping the shark, but
so I've seen the Reichenbach falls, and
trout, maybe.
I'm not 100% sure it would actually have killed them. It's not that enormous a drop.
Obviously, it didn't.
Well, yeah.
Well, yeah, but you know, one of them crawling out of the pool one way at the bottom, and one of them crawling out of it the other way at the bottom.
Giving each other a nasty look.
It's like all those terrible old movie serials where, you know, oh my God, how's he going to get out of that? And he gets out of it by, oh my God, he's going to drown, and he gets out of it by getting out of the water.
So if we kind of go from there and take it into the modern world with the work that you guys are doing, with the stories that you're wanting to tell, if you had advice, if you had something that you were going to tell somebody who wanted to write something in this Holmesian world, what's the one thing that you really think that they need to do it well? Because we've talked a lot about what worked, what didn't, and what's been done well, what hasn't been done well. But for you, what's the thing that somebody needs to grab onto to do this well?
Yeah, I got a good one for that, because I actually just did a talk about this recently. Stop trying to do a story that's the biggest thing Holmes ever did, or the most this, or the big, you know, the worst that. We've already seen those stories start that way. And even when Doyle started, like, this is the most singular case ever had, it's really not. I think it's, you know, him getting excited because he's writing the thing and he's telling himself it's going to be a better, really good story, but the stories don't always live up to it. It's better if you have that compelling case or interesting case. The best Sherlock Holmes stories are the ones that start with very mundane clues, like the Four Garridibs, where it's pretty mundane, and then it just keeps building and getting more and more interesting. Those are the kinds of cases that make the best Sherlock Holmes stories. When I read a Sherlock Holmes anthology, the ones where clearly they have read Holmes, big point. A lot of people think that they can write a Sherlock Holmes story after having seen movies. No. You actually got to read the Holmes stories, and then from there, you know, ease the characters into it. In that, you know, something mundane happens. Holmes may take it kind of as a, oh, well, I got nothing better to do, or it's a friend of a friend, like, you know, as Mrs. Hudson's friend comes in for one story. I forget which one it was, where, you know, he did it as a favor to his landlady. It turns out to be a huge case. That sort of stuff, I think, allows you to have a fresher voice and to focus more on constructing an interesting mystery rather than trying to do a Sherlock Holmes in big caps sort of story. The best Sherlock Holmes stories were compelling, character-driven mysteries, not detail-driven. They were character-driven mysteries. Start there, you're in a good zone.
I think one of the other things I love to see is, again, bringing up the stage magician, is when he has a baffling clue that ends up not having anything to do with the mystery itself, but leads him into it, like the Red-Headed League, which I thought was a lot of fun. Yeah. And had the solution to it naturally had nothing to do with the fact that the fellow who came to him had red hair and was a genuine redhead. But it was a lot of fun to have that as the basis for the fraud that was developing, and the mystery that came out of that. It's don't follow this hand, follow this one.
Yeah.
And I like that he was so good at creating the way to bring you into the story. You know, if you keep following the first thing that he brings in, you're going to miss something, and then it will be there all along.
Yeah.
But you won't see it until the end, unless you are paying attention. It's dropping the details into the story and being fair at your mystery, foreshadowing properly, making certain that it's complex enough, that it's worthy of Holmes's attention, and naturally throwing in a human element that Sherlock has a reason for helping this person. Mm-hmm. That really, really compelling, I need to help this person because, helping the landlady is good. A young lady appeals to him, a mystery on behalf of someone who really needs help. Because, yes, along with a sense of justice, Holmes does have a sense of compassion. So I want to see that in a Holmes story as well.
To your point, Jody, one of the most famous and beloved Holmes stories is one where he's helping out an old college friend, the Musgrave Ritual.
Yes.
And yet that's one of the most compelling stories, but it was him going for a couple of days, in the country with a college friend. He's telling the story to Watson, by the way. Watson's not actually in the story.
Right, and because he was a very young man at the time, too.
Yeah, and he didn't expect anything to happen. The Devil's Foot. Watson drags him out to the country because he's having a nervous breakdown, and he wants Holmes to have relaxed. And of course, he gets into a mystery, but you don't see.
Well, that's what relaxes him.
Yeah,
I think it's also if you're doing a Holmes story that takes place in the late 19th century, you really need to be familiar with what the 19th century was like. Conan Doyle knew what it was like because he was living it. And there's a lot of assumptions that people will make that Holmes made that made sense at the time that wouldn't necessarily make sense to a modern audience. One of the stories that I did for the Baker Street Irregulars anthology were both basically modernizing existing Conan Doyle stories, which was a lot more challenging than I thought it was going to be, because there are certain things and assumptions that a 19th century person would make that a 21st century person would not, or that just don't apply because of the march of science over the last 150 years. So that's part of the challenge, and policing was different too. One of the more successful Holmes pastiches was on, of all places, Star Trek: The Next Generation. When they had Data and LaForge going into the holodeck to play it being Holmes, and there were a couple of deductions that Data made as Holmes that only make sense to a 19th century person, like the fact that the guy had rubber soles, which meant he probably worked with electricity, because only at that time only somebody who worked with electricity would have a rubber soled shoe. Nobody else would. That was a perfect little touch.
I also liked that Moriarty. I thought that was a really terrific approach for him.
Daniel Davis did an excellent job playing that.
Yeah, he was great.
Yeah. But that's it really helps to be aware of what life was like. So you have to not only read those stories, but read other fiction that takes place in the same era. Just to be and make yourself familiar with how people talked and the assumptions that people make. And if you're trying to modernize it, you have to keep that in mind too. Police procedure is much different now. It's much closer to what Holmes did then for just an ordinary detective now, which makes it much more challenging. One of the reasons why Criminal Intent worked is because Gorin was an NYPD detective. The modern police forces aren't likely to hire a consulting detective for any good reason, and a lot of the ones we see on television are not. Monk works because he was an ex-homicide cop, and he's only not a cop because of the trauma he went through. So that works. Psych really doesn't. That's not even remotely convincing. Castle wasn't remotely convincing. The Mentalist wasn't remotely convincing in that regard. But
you're not latching on to Lucifer.
Yeah.
That's even less convincing. But then again, the procedural aspects of that are pretty much incidental at this point.
Another thing about the authenticity of the Sherlock Holmes stories in terms of when they took place is they didn't all take place in 1896. I mean, you have stories that go, before that, from Studying Scarlet all the way up to World War I.
Yeah.
So he's in both 19th and 20th centuries. He's a different person during those times. His relationship with Watson is not the same all the way through it. They were friends for I think 20 years or 23 years, I think it was in the series. But they were not partners all that time. So there are a lot of times when Holmes is alone. There are also times when Holmes is telling the story, trying to use Watson's method. Those are things people can try. They read the stories. There's a lot of entry points for both originality as well as a serious nod to, when the stories took place, what the culture was, what the technology was. You have one story where somebody has gas, is turning gas on in the house, another where they're flicking a light switch.
Social attitudes.
Social attitudes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Very different. Yes.
So that's why, again, reading and expands the mind.
I've heard that.
Reading is good for you. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming and joining me this evening, and I hope everybody's had a good time. So we're going to go back around one more time and have everybody let you know where you can find you, website, social media, all that kind of good stuff. Jody Lynn, will let you go first.
Okay, I'm on Facebook a bit, and my website is currently under construction or reconstruction, but it's jodylynnye.com, 3 N's and 3 Y's. So stop by and see if I managed to get my webmaster to put it back on the air. But I appear at a few conventions now and again. I'm looking forward to Dragon Con at the beginning of September and a few others after that. So stop by and say hello.
Jonathan?
JonathanMaberry.com. Just spell my last name right. It's M-A-B, not M-A-Y-B. Do not fall into the temptation to put that Y in the middle of my name. Scottish spelling, not the English spelling. But I'm all over social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Find me anywhere. And I do a weekly Ask Me Anything on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern on Facebook, just, to talk about life, the universe, and everything. So yeah, that's I'm not doing any appearances this year because of COVID, but I will be back in the game making appearances next year, and I'm doing a lot of stuff online. So come and find me and have a little fun.
Keith?
If you search for Keith R.A. DeCandido or just Keith DeCandido, I am literally the only one who will turn up. If you go to DeCandido.net, which is my last name, .net there, that is my incredibly terrible website that links to all the places that I'm active. It links to my, I update my blog regularly. I'm very active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like I said, I blog regularly. I write about pop culture for Tor.com. And I have a YouTube channel where I do readings of my short fiction, which I started last year when the apocalypse hit as a way of entertaining people while they were stuck at home. And I have a Patreon, patreon.com/crad, which has excerpts from my works in progress, TV and movie reviews, vignettes featuring my original characters, and best of all, cat pictures, because that's what the internet is actually for. So.
And I've been
and you can. And I should mention, you can find all 3 of us in the Baker Street Irregulars books, edited by Michael A. Ventrella and Jonathan Maberry, where we all did our little various Sherlock Holmes pastiches. I did the Shirley Holmes and Jack Watson in Modern New York stories, and you should definitely go out and buy them, because the more you buy, the more royalty money we make, and that's
get the important part.
Yes.
And I've had the pleasure of being your host this evening, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, and of course, here at ConTinual. They occasionally let me out of my box. Everybody have a good evening, and we will see you again next time.
Bye.